As the night slowly settles in and everything becomes calm and quiet, it's the perfect moment to listen to a fairy tale, a story that has been softly told from one generation to the next. Imagine a world where logic takes a gentle nap, where the most peculiar creatures are the norm, and where every turn brings a new, enchanting surprise. Tonight, we will journey together into a dreamscape spun from wonder and whimsy, a place where a curious young girl found herself quite literally falling into an adventure. But before the story truly begins, you should get comfortable. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. So make yourself comfortable, let the outside world fade away, and let tonight's story begin. Settle in, relax, and allow the quiet magic of the tale to carry you through the night. It was a perfectly ordinary summer's afternoon, warm and somewhat drowsy, as Alice sat idly by her sister on the riverbank. The sun dappled through the leaves overhead, casting shifting patterns on the grass, and the gentle murmur of the river flowed by. Her sister was reading from a book, but it was a book without pictures or conversations, which, to Alice's imaginative mind, made it rather dull. She found herself drifting, pondering the simple pleasure of making a daisy chain, wondering if the effort of getting up to pick the daisies was truly worth it. Her thoughts were as languid as the air around her, slowly unfurling like petals in the afternoon sun. Just as a soft yawn escaped her lips, a most peculiar sight caught her eye. A white rabbit with soft pink eyes darted past her, muttering to himself. It wasn't just any rabbit. This one wore a waistcoat and carried a pocket watch, which he pulled out with an urgent glance before hurrying along. Oh dear, I shall be too late, he fretted, his voice a tiny, anxious squeak. Alice, startled by this unexpected spectacle, blinked. A rabbit in a waistcoat consulting a watch? It was a sight so utterly out of the ordinary that it instantly chased away her drowsiness. Curiosity, a gentle whisper at first, then a growing hum in her heart, spurred her to her feet. Without a second thought, she followed. She watched as he popped down a large rabbit hole that seemed to appear almost magically beneath a hedge. A normal child might have hesitated, but Alice, filled with a sense of wonder and a yearning for something more exciting than her sister's dull book, plunged in after him. She expected to find herself in a burrow, perhaps leading to a rabbit's cozy home. Instead, the hole plunged straight down, like a well, for what felt like an eternity. The fall was slow, almost dreamlike, giving her ample time to look about and wonder what would happen next. As she tumbled, images of shelves and cupboards flashed by on either side, like a strange subterranean pantry. She even managed to snatch a jar labeled Orange Marmalade from one shelf, only to find it. With a sigh, she carefully placed it into another cupboard as she continued her descent, not wanting to drop it and break it on someone's head far below. The air was soft against her face, a gentle current carrying her down, down, down. It was a sensation not unlike floating, a strange, quiet journey into the unknown. Finally, with a soft thud, she landed on a pile of dry leaves and twigs. She wasn't hurt at all, just a little dusty and disoriented. She quickly stood up, looking around in the dim light. The white rabbit was visible for a moment, scuttling down a long, dimly lit passage, still muttering about being late, before turning a corner and vanishing from sight. Alice, without pausing, followed him down the passage. It curved and wound like a serpent, and just as she thought she might catch up, she found herself in a long, low hall. This hall was a curious place indeed. All around its walls were doors, dozens of them, of all shapes and sizes. But alas, every single one was locked. She tried each door, tugging gently on their handles, hoping for a release, but they remained stubbornly shut. Her heart sank a little, wondering if she was trapped. Then, she noticed a small three-legged table made of solid glass sitting alone in the middle of the hall. On it, there was nothing but a tiny golden key. It was so small, in fact, that it was clearly too delicate for any of the larger doors. After another careful search, she discovered a small curtain hidden behind one of the larger doors, and behind it, the tiniest door she had ever seen. It was scarcely 15 inches high. The little golden key, to her delight, fit perfectly into its lock. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a breathtaking sight, a beautiful garden filled with vibrant flowers and cool, mossy fountains. It was a place of serene beauty, bathed in a soft, ethereal light. But alas, she was much too large to even peek through the doorway. Her head was too big to fit, let alone her body. Feeling a pang of disappointment, she closed the tiny door, placed the key back on the glass table, and began to pace the hall, wondering what to do. Then she noticed a small bottle that hadn't been there before, sitting on the table. It had a paper label around its neck, with the words, "Drink me," neatly printed in large letters. It smelled sweet and inviting, and despite her usual caution about drinking unknown liquids, she felt a strange pull. After all, she reasoned, if it had been poison, it probably wouldn't have said, "Drink me," in such a polite way. She took a small sip. It tasted like a delightful blend of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, and buttered toast, all rolled into one. It was so delicious that she drank it all in a gulp. As the last drop disappeared, she felt a most peculiar sensation. She began to shrink. Her clothes became ridiculously baggy, pooling round her feet, and she felt her head grow further and further from the ceiling. She was shrinking smaller and smaller, until she was no more than 10 inches high. "Curiouser and curiouser," she murmured to herself, her voice now a tiny whisper. But as she thought about going into the lovely garden, she remembered the golden key still resting on the glass table, which was now towering above her like a skyscraper. She stretched on tiptoe, straining, but she couldn't reach it. Frustrated, she walked back to the table, hoping to find another way. This time, beneath the table, she noticed a small cake with the words, "Eat me," beautifully marked in currants. Again, her usual caution was overridden by a strange impulse. She took a bite. "Well, I'll eat it," she said. "And if it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key. And if it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door." It made her grow larger, much, much larger. Her head hit the ceiling almost immediately. She had to crouch, awkwardly bending her neck. She was now more than 9 feet tall, her feet barely fitting in the hall, her body crammed uncomfortably. Poor Alice, she felt more trapped than ever. Her head was pressed against the ceiling, and she couldn't even stand up straight. With a sigh that shuddered through the entire hall, large, shimmering tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the already dim surroundings. She felt utterly helpless, a giant in a tiny, impossible space, and her tears began to fall, slow at first, then faster, pooling on the floor around her like tiny, shimmering lakes. The tears that had begun to trickle from Alice's eyes now flowed like a torrent, a continuous stream of sorrow that quickly formed a large pool around her. As she sat there, 9 feet tall and quite miserable, her head pressed awkwardly against the ceiling, the salty water rose higher and higher. It was an astonishing amount of liquid, creating a vast lake that completely submerged the hall floor. She truly felt as if she might drown in her own despair. The air grew heavy and damp with the spray, and the faint light of the hall shimmered through the watery haze. Just as the water reached her chin, a strange sensation stole over her. She felt herself shrinking once more, though this time without the aid of a magical bottle or cake. Perhaps it was the very volume of her tears, or simply the capricious nature of this peculiar world. Whatever the cause, she found herself dwindling in size, smaller and smaller, until she was no larger than she had been after her first drink from the Drink Me bottle. Now, however, she was not merely 10 inches high, but utterly submerged in her own pool of tears. The vast hall, once her cramped prison, now felt like an endless ocean. She paddled frantically, trying to keep her head above the salty water, which tasted faintly of her own sorrow. It was a strange predicament indeed, to be swimming in her own emotions. As she splashed about, struggling to gain her bearings, she heard a soft scrabbling sound nearby. Peering through the watery gloom, she saw a creature of some sort. It was a mouse who, like herself, had fallen into the pool. His tiny whiskers twitched with fright, and he seemed to be making desperate attempts to swim. Would it be of any use now, thought Alice, to speak to this mouse? Everything is so out of the way down here that I should think very likely it can talk. At any rate, there's no harm in trying. So, in a timid voice, she began, "Oh, mouse, do you know the way out of this pool? I am very tired of swimming about here, oh mouse." The mouse looked at her rather suspiciously, Alice thought, and seemed to be trying to figure out what she was saying. Alice then remembered that perhaps the mouse was French and began again in that language, asking, "Où est ma chat?" which means, "Where is my cat?" This, as you can imagine, was precisely the wrong thing to say. The mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water, trembling all over. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice hastily, seeing how distressed he was. "I quite forgot you didn't like cats." The mouse shuddered from the tip of his tail to the ends of his whiskers. "Not like cats? Would you like cats if you were me?" he squeaked, his voice filled with indignation. Alice, trying to apologize, began to tell him about her own cat, Dinah, who was such a wonderful hunter and so good at catching mice. This, naturally, only made the mouse more agitated. He threatened to leave her, swimming away in a furious splash. "We won't talk about cats anymore if you don't like them," said Alice quickly, trying to make amends. "Are you fond of dogs?" The poor mouse simply gasped and swam away faster. "I am sorry," said Alice, her voice filled with genuine regret. "I just wanted to make conversation. You see, I get so lonely." The mouse, seeing her sincerity and perhaps sensing her own predicament, eventually consented to swim beside her, though still with a wary glance. As they continued to paddle through the seemingly endless pool of tears, they were not alone for long. Soon, other creatures began to appear, struggling in the water alongside them. There was a duck, a dodo, a lory, and an eaglet, all soaked and shivering, along with several other curious birds and beasts. They had all, it seemed, been caught in the same flood of Alice's sorrow, a motley collection of the bewildered and the bedraggled. The water was growing shallower, thank goodness, and soon they all managed to scramble out onto the bank. They stood huddled together, a peculiar circle of damp creatures, all looking thoroughly uncomfortable. The immediate problem, aside from the general strangeness of their situation, was how to get dry. The dodo, a large, solemn bird, after a few moments of thoughtful pacing, suggested a solution. The best thing to get us dry would be a caucus race. No one seemed to know exactly what a caucus race was, but everyone agreed it sounded like a good idea. The dodo proceeded to explain the rules, or rather, the lack thereof. first mark out a course, a sort of circle, you see. Then everyone runs whenever they like and stops whenever they like. So there's no specific start or finish line. And that's precisely what they did. The dodo marked out a rough circle, and all the creatures began to run. They ran for varying lengths of time, some faster, some slower, some stopping for a rest, and then starting again. Alice, for her part, ran a few laps, feeling rather silly, but willing to go along with the unusual game. After about half an hour, when they were all quite dry again, the dodo suddenly called out, "The race is over. Everyone has won, and all must have prizes." This pronouncement was met with general murmurs of agreement, though the question of what the prizes should be soon arose. The dodo, with a grand gesture, pointed to Alice. She must have prizes for everyone. Alice, feeling a bit flustered, searched her pockets and, to her surprise, found a small box of comfits. She distributed them carefully, one to each creature. There was just enough for everyone. "But what about your prize?" asked the mouse, after all the others had received theirs. "She must have a prize herself, you know." The dodo considered this deeply, then, with another theatrical gesture, took a thimble from Alice's own pocket, presented it back to her, and declared, "We beg your acceptance of this elegant thimble." Alice, though she thought it all very absurd, curtsied politely and accepted her prize. The whole affair left her feeling rather bemused, yet also strangely comforted by the company of these peculiar individuals. As they all settled down, still a little damp around the edges, the mouse began to tell a long and complicated story about why he hated cats and dogs so much. A tale full of twists and turns, with a peculiar visual layout on the page, like a long, winding tale. But Alice, growing rather tired, kept getting confused by the story's structure, her mind still grappling with the recent transformations and the sheer oddity of the day. As the mouse reached the end of his tale, he stood up, gave them a solemn nod, and declared, "I really must be going. My blood is getting too chill." And with that, he padded away into the distance, followed by the rest of the company, leaving Alice quite alone once more on the riverbank, or what had once been the bank of her own tears. The solitude was sudden and profound, leaving her to ponder the bewildering events and the lingering question of how she would ever find her way out of this labyrinth of whimsy. Left alone once more, Alice felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. The sun, or what she assumed was the sun, still cast a peculiar, soft glow, but the air felt different now, tinged with a persistent strangeness. She pondered the departed creatures, wondering if she would ever see them again, and if any of it had truly happened. Her recent adventures, shrinking and growing and swimming in her own tears, had left her feeling rather discombobulated, like a puzzle piece that no longer quite fit its original picture. The quiet returned, but it was a quiet pregnant with possibility, rather than the dull silence of the riverbank. Suddenly, in the distance, she heard a faint scurrying sound, and then a familiar voice. Agitated and breathless, the Duchess. The Duchess. Oh, my dear paws. Oh, my fur and whiskers. She'll get me executed, as sure as ferrets are ferrets. Where can I have dropped them, I wonder? It was the White Rabbit rushing past her once again, looking even more flustered than before. This time, he was not just carrying a watch, but also a pair of white kid gloves and a large fan. He seemed to be searching frantically for something. Alice, always curious, and now feeling a little more daring after her recent escapades, called out to him. "If you please, sir," the rabbit gave a start, dropping his gloves and fan in his fright, and then scurried away into the darkness as fast as his legs could carry him, leaving Alice alone with his forgotten belongings. She picked them up, noticing how dainty and soft the gloves were, and the fan, delicate and decorated with little pictures of flowers. It was then that she made a rather significant discovery. Holding the fan, she found herself beginning to shrink again, rapidly this time. "Good gracious! I'm getting smaller again," she exclaimed, dropping the fan in a panic. She realized that everything in this land seemed to have some magical property, and this particular fan was certainly no exception. Just as quickly as she had begun to shrink, the shrinking stopped once the fan was out of her hand. She was now about 2 feet tall, a comfortable size, but still not quite her original self. Still clutching the gloves, Alice began to wander again, her eyes scanning the peculiar landscape for any sign of a way out, or perhaps a familiar face. She soon came across a small, neat house, brightly painted and rather pretty, with chimneys shaped like ears. On the door, a shining brass plate read, "W. Rabbit." This, she deduced, must be the White Rabbit's home. Feeling a slight flutter of trepidation, but driven by a strange sense of obligation to return his things, she knocked. There was no answer, so she pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. The house was surprisingly large inside, with a comfortable parlor. She noticed a bottle on a table, and remembering her previous experiences, cautiously decided not to touch it. But then, feeling a sudden pang of hunger, she spotted a small cake. This time, there was no label. Feeling adventurous, she took a bite. And, of course, she began to grow, not slowly, but with astonishing speed. She grew and grew until she was so large that she couldn't fit through the door anymore. Her elbow was pressed against one side of the room, her foot against the other, and her head was forced against the ceiling. The little house creaked and groaned around her as she expanded, feeling incredibly cramped and uncomfortable. She was completely stuck. The cake, it seemed, was quite potent. Just as she was beginning to despair, she heard the frantic voice of the White Rabbit outside. "Marianne! Marianne! Fetch me my gloves this moment!" he shouted. Alice knew he was speaking to his maid, but she, of course, couldn't move. She could hear the rabbit approaching, muttering to himself about his lost belongings and the Duchess. Then a voice, clearly the rabbit's, came from just outside the window, which was now far below Alice's face. "Pat, Pat, where are you?" Another voice, a gruff, Irish-sounding one, responded, "Sure, I'm digging for apples, Your Honor." This, Alice realized, was Pat, presumably the rabbit's gardener. The rabbit then instructed Pat to go into the house through the window and find his gloves and fan. Alice heard Pat trying to squeeze through the window, grunting with effort. Knowing she couldn't let him in, she tried to push him back with her elbow. There was a surprised yelp, and then a clatter. The rabbit, exasperated, then decided to try another approach. He ordered Pat to climb onto the roof and go down the chimney. Alice heard the sounds of scrambling, and then, a moment later, a loud thud down the chimney, followed by a shower of bricks and soot. She quickly kicked out her foot, sending Pat flying back up the chimney. There was another yelp, and then silence. The rabbit, now thoroughly enraged, announced that he would burn the house down. Alice, feeling a bit guilty, but also rather defiant, wondered how she was going to get out of this mess. Fortunately, just then, she noticed some small pebbles showering down through the open window. To her astonishment, as these pebbles landed on the floor, they transformed into small, delicious-looking cakes. Remembering her previous experiences, she cautiously picked one up and took a bite. Instantly, she began to shrink again. Relief washed over her as she rapidly diminished in size until she was small enough to slip out of the door and escape the rabbit's house. She ran into a thick wood, not knowing which way to go. The sun was still shining in its peculiar way, and the air was still warm, but a sense of unease lingered. She wished she could find something to help her return to her normal size, or at least a size that felt more comfortable. After a while, she came upon a large mushroom, nearly as tall as she was. It was a beautiful fungi, with a bright red cap. Sitting calmly on top of it, smoking a large hookah, was a blue caterpillar. He paid no attention to her, just calmly puffed away at his pipe. Alice waited patiently for a few moments, feeling a little awkward. Finally, the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and addressed her in a languid, sleepy voice. "Who are you?" he asked, blowing a perfect smoke ring. Alice, flustered, replied, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then." The caterpillar considered this for a moment. "What do you mean by that?" he droned. "Explain yourself." Alice tried her best to explain the bewildering day she'd had, the shrinking and growing, the pool of tears, the Caucus race. The caterpillar listened impassively, occasionally taking another puff from his hookah. He seemed entirely unimpressed by her tale of woe. "You're not changed, I think, for the worse," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps you haven't found it yet," Alice replied softly. "But when you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will someday, you know, and then after that into a butterfly. I should think you'll feel it a little queer, won't you?" The caterpillar, rather unexpectedly, grew offended by this line of reasoning. "Not a bit," he snapped. Their conversation continued, Alice attempting to explain her desire to return to her original height, and the caterpillar offering cryptic, seemingly unhelpful advice. "One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter," he finally said, pointing vaguely to the mushroom. "One side of what? The mushroom?" Alice asked, confused. "Exactly," he replied. And then, without another word, he slowly crawled off the mushroom and disappeared into the grass, leaving Alice alone with the large fungi. Alice, after a moment of thoughtful consideration, decided to investigate the mushroom. She carefully broke off a piece from one side, and then, taking a small bite, found herself shrinking rapidly. Too rapidly. She quickly took a bite from the other side and began to grow. She spent several anxious moments alternately shrinking and growing, her neck stretching to an enormous length, then her body becoming impossibly tiny, until she finally managed to achieve a comfortable, manageable size of about 9 inches tall. She held on to the remaining pieces of mushroom carefully, knowing they were powerful tools in this unpredictable world. With a renewed sense of hope, she continued her journey, a tiny figure in a vast, fantastical wood, ready for whatever peculiar encounter awaited her next. Clutching her 2 precious pieces of mushroom, Alice continued to wander through the peculiar wood. The air, though still warm, felt increasingly strange, carrying faint, disjointed sounds, a distant shriek, a clatter of pans, and a constant, persistent sneezing. She tried to make sense of the direction, but the trees seemed to twist and turn in confusing ways, their branches heavy with unusual blossoms. Her recent conversation with the caterpillar, though frustratingly vague, had left her with a sense that this world operated on its own peculiar logic, a logic she was determined to try and understand. After a little while, she spotted a small house, even stranger than the white rabbits. It had a remarkably tall chimney, out of which billowed an enormous amount of smoke, and the very air around it was thick with a peppery smell that made her eyes water and her nose twitch. Standing outside the door were 2 footmen dressed in elaborate livery. One was a fish footman, holding a large letter under his arm, and the other was a frog footman with bulging eyes and a wide, self-satisfied grin. Alice watched, intrigued, as the fish footman gave a loud, formal knock on the door with his knuckle. The frog footman, instead of answering, merely stared at the sky. Then, the fish footman presented the letter to the frog footman, bowed low, and in a solemn voice announced, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." The frog footman solemnly repeated the announcement, though with a distinct croaking sound, before turning to the door and standing aside. This seemed to be the extent of their interaction. Feeling a sudden urge to know what was going on inside, Alice approached the door and knocked timidly. The frog footman merely looked at her with his unblinking eyes. "There's no use knocking," he said in a languid, croaky voice. "And that for 2 reasons. First, because I'm on the same side of the door as you are. Secondly, because they're making such a noise inside no one could possibly hear you." Indeed, from within, a cacophony of sound erupted. Loud shrieks, a constant smashing of crockery, and a high-pitched wail that sounded suspiciously like a baby crying. Despite the frog footman's dismissive tone, Alice pushed open the door and slipped inside. The scene that greeted her was one of utter chaos. The kitchen was thick with smoke and so saturated with pepper that Alice instantly sneezed several times. In the center of the room, a large cook was stirring a massive pot, flinging plates and dishes behind her with reckless abandon. Beside her sat the Duchess, nursing a baby that squalled ceaselessly, its tiny face red and wrinkled. The Duchess was a rather unpleasant-looking woman with a very large head and a perpetually smearing expression. She spoke in short, moralizing sentences, punctuating each one with a sharp shake of the baby. "Pig!" She snarled at the baby, shaking it violently as the cook continued to toss pans around. "If everybody minded their own business," she intoned, "the world would go round a good deal faster than it does." Alice, despite her discomfort, tried to make conversation. "Please, ma'am, why is your cook putting so much pepper in the soup?" she asked, her voice a little thin amidst the noise. The Duchess merely grunted, then suddenly burst into a grotesque lullaby, shaking the baby even more fiercely. "Speak roughly to your little boy and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy, because he knows it teases." The baby let out another ear-splitting shriek. Alice felt a profound pity for the poor creature. Just then, the cook flung a heavy frying pan across the room, narrowly missing the Duchess's head. The Duchess, remarkably, didn't even flinch. "Hold it, if you please," she said to Alice, shoving the screaming baby into her arms. "I've got to get ready for the Queen's croquet game." And with that, she swept out of the room, leaving Alice alone with the furious cook and the wailing infant. Alice tried her best to comfort the baby, rocking it gently and attempting to hum a soothing tune. But the baby continued to squall, its cries echoing through the peppery kitchen. Then she noticed a very peculiar thing. The baby's nose was turning up quite sharply, and its eyes were growing smaller. Its little chin was receding, and its skin was growing coarse and bristly. With a sudden gasp, Alice realized that the baby in her arms was rapidly transforming into a pig. She hurried out of the kitchen, carrying the pig baby, and released it into the woods. It grunted happily and trotted off, clearly much more at home in the forest than in the Duchess's chaotic kitchen. As she walked on, still pondering the absurdity of a pig baby, she noticed a large tree with a branch that seemed to hang in midair. Sitting on this branch, grinning from ear to ear, was a large striped cat, the Cheshire cat. Its smile was so wide that it seemed to encompass its entire face, and its eyes twinkled with a mischievous light. "Cheshire Puss," Alice began hesitantly, "would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" The cat's grin only widened. "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to," said the cat, its voice a soft, purring rumble. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat, "so long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if only you walk long enough." Alice felt this was undeniably true, but not particularly helpful. "What sort of people live about here?" she asked, trying a different approach. "In that direction," the cat said, waving a paw to its right, "lives a hatter. And in that direction, waving the other paw, lives a March hare." Visit either you like. They're both mad." Alice stared at the cat. "But I don't want to go among mad people," she protested. "Oh, you can't help that," said the cat. "We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad." Alice denied it. "How do you know I'm mad?" said the cat. "You must be," said the cat, "or you wouldn't have come here." With a final lingering grin that remained in the air even after the rest of its body had faded away, the Cheshire cat vanished. Alice, left alone with only the disembodied smile, decided to take its advice and walk in the direction of the March Hare, reasoning that a Mad Hatter was likely to be even madder. Soon enough, she heard voices in the distance, and following the sound, she came upon a large table set out under a tree. It was laid for a massive tea party, but only 3 people were there: the March Hare, the Mad Hatter, and a dormouse who was fast asleep between them. The table was full of cups and plates, but they were all clustered at one end. "No room! No room!" they cried out when they saw Alice approaching, though there was clearly plenty of space. "There's plenty of room," said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. "Have some wine," the March Hare offered, gesturing grandly. Alice looked around, but saw no wine. "I don't see any wine," she stated. "There isn't any," said the March Hare smugly. "Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it," said Alice angrily. "It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited," retorted the March Hare. This was clearly not a typical tea party. The Hatter, with his wild hair and a large price tag on his hat, then asked Alice a riddle. "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" Alice, pleased at the thought of a proper riddle, tried to guess, but the answer was never given, as the Hatter then turned to the sleeping dormouse, who occasionally muttered things in his sleep. The conversation twisted and turned, full of non sequiturs and illogical statements. They were perpetually stuck at 6 o'clock, which meant it was always tea time, and they had no time to wash the dishes, merely shifting around the table to find clean cups. The Mad Hatter seemed obsessed with time, believing it to be a person he had offended, causing it to refuse to do anything he asked. Alice felt increasingly frustrated by their utter lack of sense, their rude remarks, and the way they insisted on telling stories about 3 little sisters who lived in a treacle well. "I think you might do something better with the time," said Alice, "than wasting it in asking riddles that have no answers." The Hatter merely shook his head. "If you knew time as well as I do," he said, "you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him." The conversation devolved into another argument about grammar and the nature of time. Alice, unable to bear their maddening illogic any longer, stood up in disgust. "It's the stupidest tea party I ever was at in all my life," she declared, and walked away, not even bothering to look back. The sounds of their nonsensical chatter faded behind her, and she felt a strange mix of relief and lingering confusion as she continued deeper into the bewildering land. Alice walked away from the Mad Hatter's tea party, the sounds of their nonsensical chatter and the clatter of teacups slowly fading behind her. She felt a profound sense of relief, though it was tinged with a lingering frustration. The sheer illogic of the Hatter, the March Hare, and the sleeping dormouse had been almost unbearable. She longed for a return to some semblance of order, to a place where words meant what they said and actions had predictable consequences. She wandered for a while, the peculiar trees of the wood giving way to a more formal, manicured landscape. The air, which had been thick with the scent of pepper and stale tea, now carried the faint fragrance of roses. As she rounded a bend in a path bordered by tall hedges, she gasped. Before her stood a magnificent garden, vibrant with color, but with a strange sight unfolding within it. 3 gardeners, shaped like playing cards, 2 of clubs, 5 of clubs, and 7 of clubs, were busily painting a rose tree. Its blooms were white, but they were carefully applying red paint to each one. Alice, Her curiosity piqued once more, watched them for a moment. "Why are you painting those roses?" she asked softly, startling the card gardeners, who jumped as if struck by lightning. The two of clubs, trembling, explained, "The fact is, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake. And if the Queen finds out, we shall all have our heads cut off, you know." As he spoke, a grand procession began to approach in the distance, heralded by trumpets. "The Queen! The Queen!" the gardeners whispered in terrified tones, falling flat on their faces. Alice, though confused, stood her ground, wanting to see this formidable queen. First came 10 soldiers armed with clubs. Then 10 courtiers dressed as diamonds, followed by 10 royal children, all adorned with hearts. After them came the guests, mostly kings and queens. And among them, much to Alice's surprise, she recognized the White Rabbit, looking magnificent in a splendid scarlet uniform, carrying a golden trumpet, and wearing a proud, if still anxious, expression. Finally, majestically, came the Queen of Hearts herself. She was a formidable figure indeed, short, stout, and with a face that seemed perpetually poised for a rage. She had small, sharp eyes and a wide, cruel mouth. Beside her walked the king, a rather meek and nervous man, constantly trying to calm his wife's volatile temper. Alice had never seen anyone look quite so angry, even when simply walking. The first thing the queen did upon entering the garden was to notice the card gardeners lying prostrate. "Get up!" she shrieked, her voice like a rusty hinge. They rose, trembling. "What have you been doing here?" she demanded, her gaze falling upon the half-painted rose tree. The two of clubs tried to explain, stammering about the mistake, but before he could finish, the queen's face turned scarlet. "Off with their heads!" she bellowed, with a terrifying finality. The 3 gardeners were immediately seized by the soldiers and dragged away. Alice, feeling a surge of indignant courage, stepped forward. "Nonsense!" she cried out. "You shan't do that!" The queen turned her furious gaze on Alice. "Who are you?" she shrieked, her voice shaking the very air. "My name is Alice, so please your majesty," Alice replied, feeling a little braver now that she had actually spoken. "And this is my garden, not yours." The queen narrowed her eyes. "Are you daring to contradict me?" she demanded. Alice, emboldened, simply said yes. The queen, momentarily stunned by this unexpected defiance, then shrieked, "Off with her head!" But before the soldiers could move, Alice, remembering her mushroom, quickly took a bite from the growing side. She shot up in height, suddenly towering over the entire court, her head almost among the branches of the trees. The soldiers, looking bewildered, found themselves staring up at a giantess. "Who cares for you?" Alice scoffed, looking down at the queen. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." The soldiers, unsure how to approach such a colossal figure, hesitated. The queen, for once, was speechless, her face a mask of furious disbelief. After a tense moment, during which Alice decided to take another small bite of the mushroom to return to a more manageable size, the queen composed herself and, ignoring Alice's outburst, turned her attention to the day's main event, the croquet game. "We shall have a game of croquet," she announced, her voice still strained with suppressed fury. This, Alice soon discovered, was no ordinary game of croquet. The mallets were live flamingos, struggling and squawking under the players' arms. The balls were live hedgehogs, which had a tendency to unroll themselves and scurry away just as a player was about to strike them. And the hoops were soldiers, who had to bend themselves double and would constantly get up and walk to different parts of the ground. The entire field was uneven, full of ridges and furrows, and the whole affair was utterly chaotic. Alice found it almost impossible to play. Her flamingo kept twisting its neck back to look at her with a puzzled expression, and when she tried to make it hit the hedgehog, it would squawk indignantly and fly upwards. The hedgehog, too, would often curl up into a ball and refuse to move, or suddenly dart off in an unexpected direction. The card soldiers, acting as hoops, moved about freely, further adding to the confusion. The queen, of course, played with ferocious intensity, constantly shouting, "Off with his head," or "Off with her head," at anyone who displeased her, which was almost everyone. The unfortunate players, terrified of her rage, would often simply lie down and let the queen win, or pretend to hit their hedgehogs in the wrong direction to avoid her wrath. Alice saw several courtiers being led away by the card soldiers, presumably to be executed, though she never actually saw any heads being removed. She found herself growing more and more frustrated and disillusioned with the entire senseless game. She sought out the Cheshire cat, whose grin she saw floating in the air above a distant tree. "How are you getting on?" the cat purred, its disembodied smile growing wider. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice complained, hitting her hedgehog, which immediately uncurled and scurried between her legs. "And they're all so dreadfully cross, it's enough to make one hate croquet forever." Just then, the queen passed by, her face a thundercloud. She spotted the cat's head. "Who are you talking to?" she demanded of Alice. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce him." "I don't like the look of it," said the queen. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," the cat remarked. The queen, seeing only the cat's head, demanded, "Off with his head!" But the executioner, a burly card soldier, found himself in a quandary. "You can't cut off a head unless there's a body to cut it off from," he argued. The king, trying to mediate, suggested that if there was no body, the cat could not be said to have a head. This ignited a furious debate between the queen, the king, and the executioner, each offering increasingly absurd arguments. Alice, watching the spectacle, found it all utterly ridiculous. "It belongs to the Duchess," Alice suggested. "You'd better ask her." This seemed like a brilliant idea to the queen, who for a moment forgot her rage in the face of this logical puzzle. She sent for the Duchess to settle the matter. While they waited for the Duchess, Alice managed to escape the croquet game, finding herself once more near the edge of the chaotic field. She watched as the Duchess arrived, arm in arm with the queen, looking surprisingly cheerful. The queen, for her part, was smiling, a rare and unsettling sight. The Duchess, it seemed, had a peculiar way of making everything a moral lesson. "Whatever you do, my dear," she said to Alice, "always remember the moral. Take care of the sense, and the sounds will take care of themselves." Alice, still pondering the cat's disembodied head, found herself more bewildered than enlightened. The queen then asked the Duchess if she had seen the cat. The cat's grin reappeared just as the Duchess looked, causing the queen to shriek with rage again. Before another "off with his head" command could be issued, the cat slowly and deliberately faded away completely, leaving only its famous grin floating in the air. Then that too vanished. The argument was, for the moment, postponed. Alice felt utterly exhausted by the endless absurdity. The croquet game continued in a desultory fashion, but her heart wasn't in it. She was still trying to grasp the rules of this unpredictable world, where logic was turned on its head, and every creature seemed intent on causing confusion. She longed for a quiet conversation, a sensible explanation, or perhaps just a comfortable chair and a good book without pictures. Just then, she heard the queen shouting again, "Get to your places, everyone. It's time for the griffin." Alice, unsure what a griffin was, but dimly aware that it was likely another strange encounter, prepared herself for the next chapter of her bewildering journey. As Alice stood there, amidst the lingering confusion of the croquet game, she heard the queen's booming voice again, cutting through the general chaos like a sharp sword. "Get to your places, everyone. It's time for the griffin." A moment later, the Queen's fury seemed to settle on Alice. "You, child, come with me," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. Alice, with a sigh of weary resignation, found herself being led away from the croquet grounds, past rows of bewildered card soldiers and fluttering flamingos. Suddenly, a creature unlike any she had seen before bounded up to the Queen. It had the head and wings of an eagle, with bright, piercing eyes, but the body and hind legs of a lion. Its fur was golden, its feathers magnificent, and it looked rather self-important, though its expression was kindly enough. This, Alice deduced, must be the griffin. The Queen, without a pause, pointed a gloved finger at Alice. "Take her away and show her the mock turtle, and tell him to tell her his story. I'm tired of her." And with that, the Queen stalked off, presumably to continue her reign of terror over the croquet game. The griffin, a creature of immense power, yet surprisingly gentle demeanor, turned to Alice. "Come on," it said in a gruff but friendly voice. Alice, a little intimidated but also relieved to be away from the Queen, followed. They walked for a little while, the griffin moving with a strange, loping gait, its great wings occasionally rustling. The air here was softer, less charged with the Queen's frantic energy, and the light seemed to filter through the trees in a more serene way. "What is the mock turtle?" Alice ventured to ask, trying to make conversation. The griffin sighed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "It's what mock turtle soup is made from," it explained. Alice was instantly intrigued. She had heard of mock turtle soup, but had never truly understood its origin. "He's a very sad creature," the griffin added, "but he tells a good story." They soon came upon a small rocky ledge overlooking a calm, shimmering sea. Sitting on the ledge, looking utterly forlorn, was the most extraordinary creature. It had the head and flippers of a turtle, but its body was covered with the markings of a calf, its tail long and curly like a pig's. Great tears streamed from its enormous melancholic eyes, and it heaved deep, sorrowful sighs that seemed to shake its very frame. This was the mock turtle, and he certainly looked every bit as sad as the griffin had described. "This here is the mock turtle," said the griffin, gesturing with a paw. "She wants to hear your history, she does." The mock turtle gave a heart-wrenching sob, so profound that it seemed to reverberate through the very rocks. "I can't tell it without weeping," he wailed, his voice a deep, mournful bellow. "Then don't," said the griffin, with an air of exasperated practicality. "We'll just listen to the first part." The mock turtle cleared his throat with a sound like bubbling water, wiped his eyes with the back of his flipper, and began. "Once, I was a real turtle." He then dissolved into fresh tears. Alice waited patiently. "When we were little," he continued, after composing himself slightly, "we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise." "Why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one?" Alice interrupted, unable to resist. "We called him Tortoise because he taught us," the mock turtle explained, a hint of indignation in his tear-filled voice. "You are very dull," added the griffin, looking sternly at Alice. Alice apologized, feeling a little foolish. The mock turtle then resumed his tale, describing his wondrous education. "We had the best lessons. In fact, we had lessons every day. As a matter of course," he declared. "The courses were reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with," he said, listing the subjects with a woeful air. "And then the different branches of arithmetic, ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision." Alice, utterly bewildered, listened intently. She knew arithmetic had 4 branches, but these certainly weren't the ones she was familiar with. "And how many hours a day did you do lessons?" Alice asked, trying to grasp the schedule of this peculiar school. 10 hours the first day, 9 the next. and so on," replied the Mock Turtle. "What a curious plan," Alice exclaimed. "That's the reason they're called lessons," the Gryphon chimed in, "because they lessen from day to day." This, Alice thought, was perhaps the only sensible thing she had heard all day, even if it was a pun. Then there was a drawing master, of course. The Mock Turtle continued, his voice softening with wistful memory. "He taught us drawing, stretching, and fainting in coils." Alice tried to imagine what fainting in coils might look like. "What did you draw?" she asked. "Treacle, mostly," he sighed. "And the French master?" the Gryphon interjected. "He taught us to laugh and grow fat." The Mock Turtle then explained that he had taken all the regular courses, including mystery, ancient, and modern, with seaography, then drawling. The drawling master was an old conger eel that used to come once a week. He taught us drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils. Alice, quite confused, asked, "What was that like?" The Mock Turtle showed her, stretching his neck and writhing about, giving a rather convincing demonstration. Then came the subject of singing. "We had a singing master, too," he recalled, "who came once a week. He taught us to sing turtle soup." And with that, the Mock Turtle, tears still streaming down his face, began to sing in a tremulous, mournful voice. "Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen, who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup, soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Beau-ootiful soup, beau-ootiful soup, beau-ootiful soup. Duchess, Duchess, why do you soup? Duchess, Duchess, why do you soup? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup, beau-ootiful soup, beau-ootiful soup, beautiful soup. Who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give all else for 2 pennyworth of beautiful soup? Pennyworth of beautiful soup? Beau-ootiful soup, beau-ootiful soup." His voice faded into a mournful wail, and he buried his face in his flippers, sobbing uncontrollably. Alice felt a profound sympathy for him, even amidst the absurdity of the song. The Gryphon, perhaps used to these emotional outbursts, patted him gently on the back. "He sings it beautifully, doesn't he?" the Gryphon whispered to Alice. "It makes him hungry for soup, though, doesn't it?" Alice nodded, not knowing quite what to say. The Mock Turtle, after a few more moments of lamentation, looked up again, his eyes still brimming. "You've no idea how delightful it is when you can actually taste the soup." Alice tried to offer comfort, but the Mock Turtle was already lost in his memories. "Enough about lessons," the Gryphon interrupted, sensing the Mock Turtle was veering into another bout of sadness. "Tell her something about the games, now." The Mock Turtle brightened slightly at this suggestion. "Ah, the games. We used to play at sea dances. The lobster quadrille, you know?" "What's the lobster quadrille?" Alice asked, her mind conjuring images of dancing crustaceans. The Mock Turtle paused, looking at the Gryphon. "Shall we show her the first figure?" he asked, still tearful, but with a glimmer of excitement. The Gryphon agreed, and the 2 strange creatures stood up, mimicking the dance steps in the air. The Mock Turtle explained the dance. "First, you form a line along the seashore," he began, showing the movement with his flippers. "2 lines," interjected the Gryphon, demonstrating a more vigorous step. "Then you advance twice, with a lobster as partner." Alice giggled, finding the image delightful. "Then you change lobsters and retire in the same order." The Mock Turtle continued, describing how they would throw the lobsters out to sea and then swim after them. Alice was utterly enchanted by this bizarre description. "What a beautiful dance!" she exclaimed. "Would you like to try it?" asked the Mock Turtle, a genuine smile momentarily replacing his melancholy. But before they could begin, a distant sound reached their ears, a loud, clear trumpet blast. "The trial's beginning," cried the Gryphon, suddenly urgent. "Come on." He seized Alice by the arm and began to drag her away from the seashore and the still sobbing mock turtle. Alice, surprised by the abrupt change, looked back at the mock turtle, who waved a flipper sadly. The trumpet call grew louder, signaling a new, perhaps even more dramatic development in this bewildering world. Alice felt a jolt of nervous excitement. A trial. Whose trial could it be? And what fresh absurdity awaited her there? The griffin, responding to the urgent trumpet blast, pulled Alice along, away from the melancholy mock turtle and the shimmering seashore. They hurried back through the strange winding paths of the garden, the griffin's powerful strides carrying Alice almost off her feet. The trumpet call grew louder and more insistent, a clear summons to some momentous event. Alice, her mind still reeling from the lobster quadrille and the mournful song, felt a surge of nervous anticipation. What new spectacle awaited her? They soon arrived at a grand hall, far more imposing than any she had seen before. It was bustling with activity, filled with a strange assembly. The air was thick with expectation, and a general murmur ran through the crowd. In the center of the hall, seated on a magnificent throne, was the Queen of Hearts, her face a mask of stern, self-important authority. Beside her sat the king, looking rather flustered, and continually trying to adjust his crown. All around them were rows of playing cards. Soldiers, courtiers, and even some of the unfortunate croquet players Alice had seen earlier, now looking anxious and solemn. Before the king and queen, in the prisoner's dock, stood the Knave of Hearts. He looked pale and nervous, his hands fidgeting with a small piece of paper. The target of their attention, however, was a large table laden with plates of tarts, so invitingly arranged that Alice's mouth watered just looking at them. The scent of raspberry and cream filled the air, making the whole scene even more tantalizing and absurd. "There he is, the Knave of Hearts," the griffin whispered to Alice, gesturing with a paw towards the prisoner. "He's accused of stealing the queen's tarts." Alice remembered the nursery rhyme and suddenly understood the gravity of the situation, at least in this peculiar land. The trial began with the White Rabbit, splendidly dressed in a uniform adorned with diamonds, acting as the herald. He blew a loud blast on his trumpet, and then, unrolling a long scroll, announced in a trembling voice, "Silence in the court." The king, meanwhile, adjusted his spectacles and peered at the assembled jury. The jury was perhaps the most peculiar sight of all. They consisted of 12 creatures, a number of animals and birds, all looking thoroughly confused, and prominently the dormouse from the tea party, who was fast asleep in the front row. They were all scribbling furiously on slates, even though no evidence had yet been presented. "What are they doing?" Alice whispered to the griffin. "They're putting down all their names," the griffin explained, "for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial." "Stupid things," Alice muttered, shaking her head. The king, looking rather pleased with himself, then declared, "Read the accusation." The White Rabbit cleared his throat and read from his scroll. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them quite away." "Consider your verdict," said the king to the jury as soon as the poem was finished. "Not yet, not yet," the White Rabbit hastily interjected. "There's a great deal to come before that." The king, looking a little crestfallen, agreed. The first witness was the Mad Hatter, who shuffled nervously to the stand, a teacup in one hand and a slice of bread and butter in the other. He still wore his wildly adorned hat. "Give your evidence," commanded the king, "and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot." This threat, of course, only made the Hatter more nervous. The Hatter trembled so much that he dropped his teacup and bread. He tried to explain that he had only just begun tea with the March Hare and the Dormouse when he was summoned. "I am a poor man, your majesty," he stammered, and I hadn't even finished my tea. The king demanded to know when he had begun tea. The 14th of March? I think it was, said the Hatter, after a moment of thought. The 14th of March, I think it was, repeated the March Hare, who had also been summoned, and was standing beside him. The 15th, added the Dormouse, who suddenly woke up for a moment, then fell back asleep. The king, entirely confused by this, asked for more details. "Take off your hat," he commanded. "It isn't mine," said the Hatter. "Stolen," cried the Queen, clapping her hands. "No, it's a hat I sell," the Hatter explained. "I'm a Hatter." The king, exasperated, ordered him to leave, threatening to cut off his head if he didn't. The Hatter, terrified, scurried out of the court, leaving Alice feeling increasingly bewildered by the lack of any actual evidence. The next witness was the Duchess's cook, still wielding a large pepper pot. She gave her evidence in a series of sneezes, refusing to answer any direct questions and simply repeating, "You'd better ask the Duchess." The king, frustrated, ordered her away. Alice, meanwhile, was growing larger. She had entirely forgotten her mushroom, and with all the excitement, she found herself expanding. She suddenly felt a sharp pain in her chin and looked down to see the Dormouse, who had been resting its head on her shoulder, angrily trying to claw her. "I beg your pardon, Alice," said softly. "I'm growing." The Dormouse, grumbling, shuffled away. Alice realized she was once again too large for the room, her head touching the ceiling, her body crammed uncomfortably. "Silence!" cried the White Rabbit, nervously looking up at Alice. "Order in the court!" The king, noticing Alice's sudden growth, looked alarmed. "You are too big," he said to Alice. "You've no right to be here." "I'm not too big," Alice retorted, rather indignantly. "You're only a pack of cards." This bold statement caused a stir, but the king, eager to regain control, announced, "Let the jury consider their verdict." "No," cried Alice. "There's more evidence to come yet. This paper has just been brought in." The White Rabbit, indeed, held a new piece of paper, a small parchment scroll. "What is in it?" asked the Queen, her eyes glinting. "I haven't opened it yet," said the White Rabbit, "but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody." "It must have been that," said the king, looking very profound, "for it's written by the prisoner and sent to nobody. So, of course, it's a letter." The Queen, however, had her doubts. "Who is it addressed to?" she demanded. "It isn't addressed at all," said the White Rabbit. "Then it isn't a letter," said the king. "It must be a copy of verses," said the Queen, "or it wouldn't be written on parchment." The White Rabbit, looking utterly baffled, began to read the verses. "They told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her one, they gave him two. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free, exactly as we were." As the White Rabbit finished reading, a profound silence fell over the court. No one seemed to understand a word of it. "That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet," said the king triumphantly, turning to the jury. "It proves his guilt." "It proves nothing of the sort," said Alice, who now stood at her full, enormous height, her voice booming through the hall. She felt a wave of indignation at the sheer absurdity of the proceedings. "Why, there's no sense in it, whatever." "If there's no sense in it," said the king, "that saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. And yet, I don't know," he added, looking at the jury. "I seem to see some sense in it, after all. I gave her one, they gave him 2. You gave us 3 or more. It's a very important piece of evidence." "But it's not even signed," Alice pointed out. her patience wearing thin. "And you haven't proved that the knave wrote it." "It is signed," said the king. "Look at the end of it." He held up the paper, and indeed, a tiny, almost illegible squiggle could be seen. "It's the knave's handwriting," said the White Rabbit. "It is not!" cried the knave. "I didn't write it, and nobody can prove I did. There's no name signed at the end." "If you didn't sign it," said the king, "that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like an honest man." This was the final straw for Alice. "You're all making up rules as you go along," she declared, her voice filled with a powerful indignation. "This is the most ridiculous trial I've ever seen." The queen, her face turning purple with rage, shrieked, "Off with her head!" But Alice, now far too large to be easily captured, merely laughed. "Who cares for you?" she scoffed, looking down at the queen, who was now no bigger than a playing card herself. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." With that, she swept her hand across the table, sending the cards flying. The whole pack rose into the air, swirling around her like autumn leaves, then rained down upon her, sharp and hard. Alice cried out, startled, and then felt herself falling not through the air, but gently, softly, as if waking from a very deep sleep. The cards, those flimsy painted figures of the Queen's court, swirled and fluttered through the air, their edges surprisingly sharp as they rained down upon Alice. One moment she was towering over them all, a giantess in a nonsensical courtroom, her voice booming with righteous indignation as she declared them nothing but a pack of cards. The next, she felt a sudden strange disorientation, a sensation of falling, not a physical tumble, but a gentle, almost weightless descent. The sharp sting of the cards quickly faded, replaced by a soft warmth, and the vivid, chaotic imagery of the trial dissolved like smoke. She opened her eyes, blinking against a gentle light that was far softer than the peculiar glow of Wonderland. Above her, the familiar dappled sunlight filtered through the leaves of a tall tree. The scent of damp earth and fresh grass filled her nostrils, so different from the overwhelming pepper of the Duchess's kitchen or the cloying sweetness of the Queen's garden. She found herself lying on her back, her head resting on something soft. Her arms and legs felt normal again, her body no longer stretched to uncomfortable extremes or shrunken to a tiny size. A familiar, comforting presence was beside her. "Wake up, dear Alice," a soft voice murmured. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." It was her sister, sitting beside her on the riverbank, exactly where Alice had been at the start of her incredible journey. Her sister had closed her book and was now looking at Alice with a fond, amused expression. Alice sat up slowly, feeling a little groggy, as if emerging from a very deep, vivid dream. The warmth of the afternoon sun kissed her face, a welcome sensation of solid reality. "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," Alice exclaimed, her voice still a little breathless, her mind racing to recall the fantastic details before they could slip away. She sat up fully, gathering her thoughts, eager to share her adventure with her sister. She began to recount her tale, speaking quickly, as if afraid the memories would dissipate if not spoken aloud. "You won't believe it. I followed a white rabbit who wore a waistcoat and carried a pocket watch. And then I fell down a rabbit hole, and everything was so peculiar." Her sister listened patiently, a faint smile playing on her lips, her eyes twinkling with a gentle understanding. Alice described her shrinking and growing, the little bottle labeled "Drink Me," and the cake that said "Eat Me," causing her to change size with bewildering speed. She told of the pool of tears where she swam alongside a mouse and other strange creatures, and how they all participated in a nonsensical Caucus race to dry off. Her voice took on a sense of awe as she recalled the wise, indifferent caterpillar smoking his hookah on a giant mushroom. offering cryptic advice that eventually helped her regain a manageable form. She vividly described the Duchess's chaotic kitchen, thick with pepper, where a baby turned into a pig, and the disembodied grin of the Cheshire cat, which would appear and disappear at will, offering philosophical riddles and guidance. The absurdity of the Mad Hatter's tea party, with its perpetual tea time, the rude March hare, and the perpetually sleeping dormouse, brought a chuckle to her lips, even as she recounted her frustration. They were so maddening, sister, always asking riddles with no answers and making no sense at all. And then came the Queen of Hearts. Alice described the terrifying monarch with her perpetual shouts of, "Off with his head!" and the bewildering croquet game played with live flamingos and hedgehogs. She spoke of the frightened card gardeners painting white roses red, and the meek king constantly trying to appease his furious queen. The mock turtle, with his sorrowful tale of reeling and writhing, and the enchanting, if bizarre, lobster quadrille were recalled with a hint of wistful fondness. Finally, she recounted the grand, yet utterly nonsensical, trial of the Knave of Hearts for stealing the tarts. She spoke of the ridiculous witnesses, the baffling evidence of the unsigned verses, and the king's arbitrary judgments. And then, sister, Alice exclaimed, her eyes wide with lingering excitement, I grew so big that I could barely fit in the courtroom. And I told them they were nothing but a pack of cards, and they all flew up and fell on me. She paused, her breath catching, the memory still vivid. And then I woke up. Her sister smiled, a thoughtful, tender expression on her face. She gently stroked Alice's hair. What a wonderful dream, my dear. She murmured, It sounds like a truly extraordinary adventure. Alice leaned against her sister's arm, feeling the solid comfort of her presence, the gentle breeze rustling through the grass, and the soft murmur of the river. The dream, though it had felt so real, was now receding, leaving behind a delightful, whimsical afterglow. Her sister then closed her eyes and began to dream too, in a way. She imagined Alice's fantastical world, piecing together the vibrant fragments of the story. The curious white rabbit, the gentle falling down the rabbit hole, the astonishing changes in size, the great pool of tears, and the queerly solemn procession of the Caucus race. She pictured the hedgehogs and the flamingos, the queen's shrill cries, and the vanishing grin of the Cheshire cat. She could almost hear the Mad Hatter's riddles and the Mock Turtle's mournful song. In her own mind, she built up the simple and loving heart of a child, which could make all these wonders, and even more, come into being. She knew that Alice, when she was older, would keep the memory of her childhood dream alive, holding on to the joy and wonder of it. She imagined how, in future years, Alice would gather her own little children around her, telling them the story of this strange and beautiful day, keeping the spirit of Wonderland alive for generations to come. And so, the magic, though born of a dream, would continue to weave its gentle spell. The sun began to dip lower, casting long golden shadows across the riverbank, and the world grew quiet once more, a soft hush falling over the gentle ending of a truly marvelous adventure. As the night deepens, wrapping everything in its quiet embrace, the echoes of Alice's extraordinary journey begin to softly fade. Feel the gentle calm settling around you like a warm blanket. The curious creatures and whimsical landscapes of Wonderland are now retreating to the sleepy corners of your mind, leaving behind a faint sparkle of magic. There's no need to hold on to every detail. Just let the feeling of wonder drift with you. Allow your thoughts to grow as soft and yielding as the riverbank where Alice awoke. The journey is complete, the tale's told, and the world of dreams awaits your own gentle exploration. Let your breathing slow, your muscles relax, and your mind become serene. The whispers of the story are now part of the night, guiding you towards your own peaceful slumber. Rest now, dear one, and let your dreams be as soft and comforting as the deepest part of the night.